Hello book lovers, and welcome back or welcome to Nat Cat's Bookish Cafe. Today I am here to do a very small March wrap up. If you're new to my channel, I usually split up my wrap-ups into the first half of the month and then the second half of the month. So if you're interested in seeing what I read in the first half of March, I will, as always, link that up above as well as down below if you would like to check it out. My reading has definitely slowed down the last couple of months. I've just had a lot of stuff going on in my personal life that has definitely been affecting my reading, but we are chugging along and we are still getting some good books read, and I of course want to share my reviews of those with you. I will also be going through my overall monthly stats today, but overall I only have 4 books that I will be talking about in this video. We have 3 books that I finished and then 1 book that I did DNF. Before we get into those, let's go ahead and go into the monthly stats. All right, so just like last month, I read a total of 8 books, which I would say is definitely below my average. However, I haven't been picking up a lot of audiobooks, and I would say usually I read maybe 5 to 6 physical books a month, and then the rest is all made up of audiobooks. So it's definitely not surprising that that number has decreased, as I have kind of neglected one of my formats of reading. However, this month I did read more pages than last month, and I read a total of 2,169 pages. As far as audiobook hours go, I listened to 19.54 hours worth of audiobooks. And luckily this month, my average star rating was also higher. Last month, I think it was around a 3.6. This month, I got an average of 4.13. To break down the star ratings, I did have 1 DNF, which I did not rate. Then we had 1 3-star rating, we had 1 3.5 star rating, we had 3 4-star ratings, 1 4.5 star rating, and 1 5-star rating. All right, let's go ahead and get the DNF out of the way. I definitely hinted at this during my April TBR because I did decide to DNF my first challenge book, which was one Q84 by Haruki Murakami. I got about 70 pages into this book, or closer to 80 pages, 76 pages to be exact, and I realized that at this point it was definitely giving 3 stars. And while usually I don't think there's anything wrong with a 3-star read, when that read is over 900 pages, you start to realize that it just isn't worth your time. This book would have taken an immense amount of reading time to complete, and I found that I really didn't have any issues putting it down. I was kind of reading a couple chapters of it in between the other books that I was reading, and I never felt eager to return to it. I never struggled to put it down after the 2 chapters. I was never like, oh, 1 more chapter, please, I need to know what's happening. And while the story to a degree is somewhat interesting, it's just not 900 pages worth of interesting. So it really is the page number that is causing me to decide to DNF it, that it's just not worth my time. This book is kind of a magical realism story. We were following from 2 points of view. We were following a woman who, after a unusual incident, realizes that she is viewing the world a bit differently. And then on the other hand, we are following a man who has become a ghostwriter for a story that is very interesting but was just not very well written, and he's becoming more and more obsessed with the story because despite its fantastical elements, it may be based in reality, and he is also becoming more and more intrigued by the author of the story. So like I said, an interesting concept. The characters were to a degree intriguing, but I find that I have absolutely no regrets about never knowing where this story goes. I will say that I am a little disappointed that I DNF'd my first challenge book. Hopefully that doesn't set the pace for the rest of the books. However, I did have another book by this author that was another tome on my TBR, and I know that I can go ahead and get that off of my TBR. So it is a bit of a relief safe to get 2 giant books off of my TBR because I just know that they aren't for me. I initially read this book to kind of decide if I wanted to read Murakami in the future, and I have to admit this didn't really give me my answers. I mean, it answered that I don't want to read his 800 plus page books, but I may want to pick up some of his normal length novels in the future. Moving on to the first book that I actually completed, we have Daughter of No Worlds by Carissa Broadbent, and this is the final book that I read in a vlog that I did where I was reading other YouTubers' best books of the year. So if you're interested in checking that out, I will have that linked up above if you want deeper thoughts on this book. This is a fantasy romance, which is more fantasy heavy than romance heavy, which I find is something that I do prefer. In this book, we are following a young woman named Tessara, and she is half Voltaigne, I believe is what they are called, and half regular human. And at a young age, she was sold into slavery. Her entire village was, though most of them were sent to the mines where they essentially would have died, and she was sent to one of the ruler's houses to be entertainment of a sort. Her owner had informed her that if she collected 1,000 gold pieces, he would free her. And after she presents the 1,000 gold pieces and asks for her freedom, he attempts to kill her essentially. And as she is realizing that she is about to die, some of her magic manifests in a way that it never has before and actually ends up killing him. And so a friend of her helps her flee this kingdom so that she can go to the order where she can learn to use her magic more and try to convince them to send a group of people with her back to her hometown or home kingdom of Thorel, I believe it's called, to free the other slaves there, as well as to rescue her friend who she had to leave behind. Because of the way that the order is set up, usually one has to complete an apprenticeship, which starts at, I believe, the age of like 12 or 13 and goes through the age of 18, and she is 21. So that time is kind of come and gone. So they assign her to Max, who is someone who is no longer a fan of the order. The order in a way betrayed him in the past, and he's very reluctant to become her trainer. However, after he finds out what her goal is, he decides that he will go ahead and help her with this. This is a very slow burn romance. It's also highly political. There's a lot of training that is going on throughout this story. I ended up giving it 4 stars, which was a little disappointing. I will say the first half of the story was a 4.5, and I was honestly expecting to possibly give this 5 stars, but the second half of the story lost me a little bit. I will say that plot-wise, it continued to intrigue me, but I think that I struggled a little bit with the relationship. I will say in no way that I disagree that these two shouldn't be together. I definitely think they make a good couple, but I think the pacing of the relationship was just a little clumsy, a little clunky in the second half of the book, where I felt like maybe it was a little rushed. There's a part of me that understands that our characters were going into dangerous situations and they felt like maybe they wouldn't have tomorrow to express their feelings, but I was not 100% happy with the pace of the relationship, and I think that it distracted me a little bit from everything else. I will also say that in the second half of the story, we get Max's point of view as well, so it becomes a dual POV story. And while I usually prefer a dual POV, especially when it comes to romance, I didn't find his POV 100% necessary, and I did prefer Tasana to him, so I think that also decreased my enjoyment of the story as well. Not to say that I don't like Max. I think he's a very interesting character. He is someone who experienced a lot of trauma throughout his life and is definitely in a very complicated situation where he is trying to help someone that he cares about, but that person who he's helping needs the help of someone who betrayed him and honestly is responsible for the majority, if not all, of the trauma that he has experienced in his life. So he's definitely in a bit of a sticky situation. And I definitely think that he did a really great job of opening Tasana's eyes to really how complex and gray everything is. She kind of went to the order seeing them on a pedestal as her answer to salvation, to the salvation of the slaves. And she really quickly starts to realize that they too can be corrupted and that they too can cause the death of innocent people when they're trying to achieve their own goals. So she very quickly has a splash of cold water thrown in her face about just how dangerous, if not cruel, the order can be, and just how cruel, if not murderous, she may have to be to get what she wants. I really do think that the magic system in here was interesting. I didn't always understand it, but for the most part, I never really felt lost when it came to the politics or anything along those lines. We are definitely dealing with an unstable political system. It seems like a few years ago, the king that ruled over the order passed away and was killed by a traitor, and his very young daughter has taken over and is very paranoid that she will be next. And reading about the story, you may or may not decide that she has a good reason to be paranoid, because there are definitely some people that are looking to overthrow the current system. So I had a lot of fun with this book. I will definitely be continuing with the series. We are definitely going to be moving into even more war heavy situations. This book had a lot of training in it. We were definitely building relationships. We were getting a lot of background information on our characters, as well as some history of wars in the past that are affecting the present and whatnot. So I think it was a really good setup without feeling info dumpy and not feeling like a prequel or anything. So really happy with this author, and looking forward to reading more from her. Up next, the one audiobook that I finished here in the second half, we have We Are the Ants by Sean David Hutchinson. This is one of the books that I have on my These Books Will Self-Destruct list, so I was happy to go ahead and get to it. I ended up giving this story 3.5 stars. I would say it's a relatively high 3.5. I almost gave it 4 stars, but after sitting on it for a few days, I decided that a 3.5 star just felt right. In the story, we are following Henry. His life is definitely not going so well. His boyfriend recently committed suicide, and he blames himself a lot, and he also kind of moved away from a friendship that he had with a young girl, because he also partially blamed her for his boyfriend's death. In other words, he really doesn't know who to blame. He's just really deep in his grief. He's also facing some issues along the lines that he's being abducted by aliens every once in a while, and they have presented him with a button and told him that if he presses this button, he will go ahead and save planet Earth, and if he doesn't, then in a few months, humanity will cease to exist. And at this point in his life, he really doesn't have much of a desire to save humanity. Home life is not going very well. His father left when he was relatively young. His mother is rather distant at times. His grandmother, who he loves very dearly, is suffering from dementia, and that is clearly becoming worse and worse throughout the story. And also, his brother is a bit of a bully. He's also facing a lot of bullying at school because his brother had informed the school that he thinks that he was abducted by aliens. So everyone calls him Space Boy, because obviously no one actually believes that he was abducted by aliens. However, at the beginning of this story, a new boy shows up to school. His name is Diego, and he instantly seems to want to be Henry's friend, and he is definitely not letting Henry push him away the way that Henry has been pushing everyone else away. And slowly but surely, things in his life seem to get a little better, but they continue to stay very complicated. So he is still, throughout this entire story, struggling with, should I press the button or not? I have very complicated feelings about this book. This book is young adult, but it is very dark, I would say. As I mentioned, his boyfriend had passed away. His boyfriend had passed away by suicide. So big trigger warnings for suicide. Our character feels suicidal at times as well throughout this story. So that is a big part of the book. This was maybe not the best time for me to read it when my mental health is not at its peak or anything, but I felt at the same time that it made the story more relatable. Despite this being a YA story, I felt that it was very deep. I thought the characters were very complex and three-dimensional. They were very messy and raw. All the side characters, there really wasn't any characters in this story that felt two-dimensional or that they were just slapped in there for the sake of it. Like, it feels like the author had a lot of intention between every character that he put into this book. So I would definitely say it is a older feeling YA story, just based off the emotional maturity that's required to read something like this. I also think that it had a lot of really interesting topics in it. We are dealing with bullying, we are dealing with a messy family situation, we are dealing with dementia, we are dealing with a young boy who is blaming himself for the death of his partner. We have him blaming his friend for the death of that partner while that friend is simultaneously still trying to reach out to him. We have him struggling with the fact that he is falling in love with another boy, and it feels like he's betraying the boy that left him behind. But despite him falling in love with another boy, he is still struggling to see if it is worth it to continue to live in a world where that other boy does not exist and will never exist again. He also doesn't have really any answers for why his partner committed suicide. He didn't leave any notes or anything. He really didn't talk about his mental health issues with his partner. So Henry's really kind of left with the frustration of not knowing why Jesse, his partner, ended up taking his own life. And that's just something he's struggling to come to terms with throughout the story, that he will never fully know why Jesse killed himself, that, you know, sometimes depression just really becomes too much for someone and that they may just end up taking their life very suddenly without any sort of warning. So this book was rather heartbreaking, to be honest. It was definitely not easy to read at times. I will say that our main character isn't the most likable. He is by no means 100% a victim. He can be rather cruel to those around him. There were certain times where he said things and I was completely shocked that anyone would let him get away with saying things like that. But I will say it added a lot to the story. It added a lot of layers to this story. I think that if you read it, you can definitely take a lot away from it. I just, at the end of the day, while I related to certain aspects of it, still was very aware that we are following young characters who are going through things that I never went through as a child. Luckily, I was never bullied, but there was still a slight disconnect for me from this story. I really think that if I had read it as a teenager, I probably would have given it like maybe even a 4.5, if not a 5-star rating. But I think I just waited a little too long to read this book where the characters were no longer 100% relatable to me. And so I sometimes felt like I was drifting away from the story a little bit, but I still feel like I took enough away from it for me to be able to give it a solid 3.5 star and to recommend it to people, maybe people who are younger. Once again, there are plenty of trigger warnings in here. I will go ahead and have my Goodreads linked down below. Oftentimes when I write a review, I will put trigger warnings down at the bottom because some trigger warnings could be spoilery, and there is one pretty massive trigger warning in here that could be considered very spoilery, so I'm not going to mention it. But if you are considering reading this book and you're worried about that, go ahead and check out my review of this book, which I don't think I've written yet as of this moment, but I'll write it today to make sure that it is up and ready by the time this video posts. But yes, very complicated book. I have a lot of complicated feelings about it, but at the end of the day, I think that a 3.5 is a good place for it. Right, and moving on to the final book that I read this month, we ended on a 5-star. Now I'm gonna be 100% honest, I technically finished this on the 1st of April, but I read like the last 20 to 30 pages on the 1st of April, and I read the other 540 pages in March. So I'm counting it towards this month, and that is going to be The Kingdom of Gods, which is the 3rd and final book in the Inheritance trilogy. There are still 2 novellas. One of them is in the book, but I think that the other one I'll have to gain access to some other way. Like I said, I gave this book 5 stars. It's going to be a little hard to talk about because it's the 3rd book in a series. If I understood it correctly, I want to say that this 3rd book takes place a few generations after the 2nd book, and the 2nd book I believe took place about 10 years after the 1st book. So we have definitely had a few generations come and go since all of the mayhem that occurred in the 1st book. In this story, we live in a world where the gods are very much present. In fact, in the 1st book, some of them are imprisoned by humans, and they were imprisoned there by another god who had won a major war known as the God's War. And in this 3rd book, we are following a godling, and godlings are the children of the gods. So in this world, there are 3 major gods, and all of them kind of hang out with each other and make children, no matter if they're men or women, because they're gods, so they don't have to worry about biology. And so this godling has started to realize that there are some unpleasant changes happening to them, and that these changes may have been caused by a relationship they had formed with 2 human children. And we kind of follow the journey of this godling as they are just coming to terms with these changes, but they are also starting to realize that there is a major threat, not just to humanity, but to godlings and gods alike. And that this threat may be related to something this godling has been forced to forget about their past. So I love this story. I think that the character is a very interesting character to follow. I don't want to tell you who it is, so it's very hard for me to be like, this is why it's interesting. But gods and godlings are very interesting characters. At times, it's very hard to tell if they are good or if they're bad, because they are godlings and they think very differently to mortals. And this godling especially has had a pretty rough past with mortals, and they have no problem punishing mortals for what they have done in the past. But at the same time, we see their relationship with these 2 mortal children and how much love they have for them. One of the things I really love about this series as a whole is that I think that the relationships are so interesting because we are dealing with gods, we are dealing with godlings, we are dealing occasionally with demons, we are dealing with mortals, we are dealing with all sorts of different people that are interacting in different ways. And especially with the gods and godlings, they have no problem with incest. So you never know what kind of relationship people are going to have. Like, are they going to be enemies? Are they going to be allies? Are they going to be friends? Are they going to be lovers? Are they going to be siblings? I mean, like, what the heck? Are they going to be father-son? Or are they going to be sexually interacting with each other? I mean, let me tell you, it can get a little bit weird, but it just makes for such interesting relationships to watch, and just watching them change over time is so much fun to me. I feel like it's like my favorite part of these stories. I know I've heard some people say that they can't really connect to the characters, but I absolutely love her characters so much and the relationships they have with each other. They are incredibly intricate. All characters are really raw and real and gray. We have no completely good people. We don't have any completely bad people. We are all hanging out in this gray area, which is just how it is in reality. There is no all good God. There is no all bad demon. Mortals are not always the weakest link, and it's just watching relationships and dynamics change throughout the story, especially with our character, with how much they are personally changing as well, was really interesting. I also really enjoyed just watching how they handled this threat, the sacrifices that people were willing to make, the sacrifices people were not willing to make. So overall, an interesting story, and the ending made me cry. The ending of book 2 made me cry as well. There's just something about the ending of N.K. Jemisin's books. I was like a couple chapters out from the ending and I was like, this is gonna make me cry, isn't it? And it did. It definitely made me cry, but I think that the way she ended the story was utter perfection. When I read how this was ending, I was like, oh my god, that's perfect. That's exactly how the story should have ended. And you know, it hurts. It hurts a little bit, but it is as it's meant to be. So definitely worth checking out. If you haven't read N.K. Jemisin, I highly suggest you do so. I know that a lot of people who talk about like the Broken Earth trilogy may cause you to be intimidated because they talk about how confusing it is. I will say that in this trilogy, I never felt overly confused, and I read her Dream Blood duology right there as well, and that never left me overly confused. But I'll let you know once I get to the Broken Earth trilogy if that is just a more confusing series than any of her others. But this is her debut novel as far as I know, so if you're looking for somewhere to start, I highly suggest this trilogy. Alright guys, so here are the books that I read and DNF'd here in the second half of March. I would love to know what your guys' favorite and least favorite book of the month was. Obviously, The Kingdom of Gods by N.K. Jemisin was my favorite book, and unfortunately my least favorite book was going to be The Not So Perfect Strangers, which is a book that I read for a book club. I ended up only giving it 3 stars. I thought it was a decent time, but it also wasn't anything super duper special to me. But as always guys, thank you so much for supporting my channel by watching my videos, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!